The role of billionaires in society has been under increased scrutiny since the Occupy movement of the 2010s, and especially since Elon Musk bought Twitter. But billionaires and their positions in society are deeply misunderstood. A staggering example is a recent video by Wired. If you haven't seen it, don't worry, we'll go through it point by point. It's so intellectually dishonest that to debunk their myths, who better than...
I'm Antony Davies, Associate Professor of Economics at Duquesne University and co-host of the weekly podcast Words and Numbers.
Didn't that massive wealth often start off humbly? Didn't Microsoft and Amazon start out in a garage? Aren't billionaires self-made?
There are some self-made billionaires, but if you look at the statistics, increasingly more and more of them inherited their money.
It flies in the face of the data. 70% of billionaires are self-made. And when we think about billionaires and inheritance, we think of people like Bill Gates or the Walton family that own Walmart. But we don't think about people like Oprah Winfrey, J.K. Rowling, Larry Ellison. These are all people who came up from poverty and are now billionaires. The way anyone becomes rich, billionaire or otherwise, in a free market environment is by providing people with goods and services that they like better than they like the dollars in their pockets. And so we have Jeff Bezos worth 100+ billions of dollars. How did he get this wealth? He got this wealth because we liked his Amazon services and products better than we liked our money, and we willingly made that trade. The data are pretty clear here. Billionaires largely don't inherit. Some of them do, but the vast majority of them are self-made.
But some billionaires like Elon Musk famously complain that the government already takes too much in taxes.
It's actually not true that the very rich pay a lot as a fraction of their income in taxes.
Well, first off, the idea that rich people pay less taxes is clearly false, and we know this from the government's own numbers. Every year, the Congressional Budget Office produces a report that details how much each of the various income classifications from the poor up to the top 1% pay in taxes and how much they earn. And if you look at those numbers, what you see is year after year, when you count for all income, whether it's wages or passive income, capital gains, dividends, whatever it is, take all of the income that people earn and look at that in relation to the total federal taxes they pay. And here again, all federal taxes, income taxes, capital gains taxes, payroll taxes, inheritance taxes, the whole thing. Ask yourself, at the end of the day, when all the dust settles, what fraction of their total income did people actually pay to the IRS? And the Congressional Budget Office tells us that typically a household in the top 1% pays about 30% of its income to the federal government in taxes. A typical middle-income household pays about 15%, and a typical poor household pays about 2%. So right there, you see that this is completely false, that somehow the rich are being taxed at a lower rate. And all of that ignores completely what we call transfers, that is, money that the government gives to people. If you account for transfers, the poorest households are paying negative 130%. That is, they're receiving from the federal government more money than they pay in. The typical middle-class household is round about negative 10%. They're also receiving, on average, more from the federal government than they pay in. Meanwhile, the top 1% are still at about 30% tax. So when you think about both taxes and transfers, money the government takes and money the government gives back, when you're done, really, it's only the top 40% of households in this country who are net payers to the federal system.
These people become a black hole for wealth, and they start to suck the wealth out of the economy.
This is a very strange thing to say, and I think it's motivated by confusing spending and consumption. That is, you've got a billionaire who has lots of money, and the billionaire saves a bunch of it. He doesn't consume it. And so we look at that and say, well, that's clearly hurting the rest of the economy because somehow he's sitting on this money. It's not being spent. In fact, it is being spent. It's just not being spent by the billionaire. It goes into the financial system where it's spent by companies that borrow the money, by individuals who borrow it to build houses or to buy cars, to pay for student loans. All of the money that billionaires have is being spent, some of it by them and some of it by the people that they lend it to.
Because you are competing with the very rich for the ownership of assets.
This is what economists call the fixed pie fallacy. The idea that there are so many assets out there, and the more assets that the billionaires have, the fewer assets we have. And that's a wrong way of looking at the economy. The economy isn't a fixed pie, it's a constantly growing pie. And I can give you a good example here. If you look at the human race from year 1 to year 1200, it took those 1200 years for wealth on planet Earth to double. It then took another 500 years for wealth on planet Earth to double again, then 100 years to double again, and then 50 years to double a fourth time, and that only brings us up to the early 1900s. Today, worldwide wealth, and that's adjusted for inflation, doubles every 10 years. And within a generation, it's going to be doubling every 3 to 5 years. The pie is growing. And yes, billionaires are taking a larger slice, but so are the rest of us, such that today the median family in the United States earns, adjusted for inflation, about 4 times what the median family in the United States earned in 1913. The economy is an ecosystem. Just like you have trees and birds and worms and bugs all playing the various roles that they play, each one is integral to the ecosystem. We look at the trees and they're the big things that we see. They're like the billionaires. It's harder to see the little bug that's crawling around, but if you lose the bug, the thing that eats it dies, and the thing that eats that dies, and before you know it, now the tree dies. An economy is very much like that. We're all integral players. Some of us are more press-worthy than others maybe, but we're all important in that, and we all contribute something. To say to one part of the ecosystem, the tree, you shouldn't be here because you're taking resources that could go to other parts of the ecosystem, is to misunderstand the interrelationships going on there. And yes, you can take the tree out, and for a short while there may actually be more resources for the other animals and bugs and whatnot, but long term they're all going to die. They're going to die because they rely on that tree in the same way the tree relies on them. The fact that the tree is bigger than the bug is not an indication the tree has taken something from the bug. It's simply an indication of the magnitude of what the tree is offering to the ecosystem.
In the 50s, 60s and 70s, top rates of tax, estate taxes and income taxes were massively higher. And that was a period where the economy was growing, where ordinary families could buy houses. Where standard of living was good for ordinary people.
Well, first off, the standard of living in the United States, forget about the average, look at about the person in the middle, the household in the middle. The standard of living for the median household today is far higher than it was in the 1950s. Secondly, when we think about inequality, there are a couple of problems here, and both of the problems come from the numbers generated by the Census Bureau. The Census Bureau changed how it calculates inequality in the early 1990s. And that change caused the numbers to increase. But the Census Bureau did not go back and recalculate the pre-1990 numbers. So when you look from the 1950s up to the present, you see this huge jump in inequality. It's not because inequality got worse, it's because census changed how it's calculating the thing post-1990 but didn't revise the numbers pre-1990. That's problem number one. Problem number two is that when the Census Bureau calculates inequality, it ignores the things we do to mitigate inequality. So we have a progressive tax system. The richer you are, the more you're taxed. The poorer you are, the less you're taxed. And a huge chunk of that tax money, what do we do with it? We give it to the poor. More than 50% of the government's budget is involved solely with taking money from the rich and giving it to the poor. When census calculates inequality, it ignores all of that. So if you look at people's incomes over time, take account of this adjustment that the Census Bureau made in the 1990s, and ask yourself, what do people's incomes look like after taxes and transfers, after the federal government has shifted around and taxed the rich and given to the poor? If you do that and calculate inequality, you find that inequality in the United States today is about 3% less than it was in 1947.
It is remarkable how flat a tax system the US has.
I don't understand how anyone who looks at the tax code can think that it's flat. Not only is it statutorily, that is, according to what you look in the law books, not only is it progressive, but when all the dust settles and people have done their deductions and exemptions, and if you employed your bevy of lawyers and accountants to reduce your tax burden, after you have done all of that, the Congressional Budget Office reports that the rich are paying a huge amount of taxes relative to their income compared to what the poor are paying. We have a highly progressive system. And what do we do with that progressive taxes that we're taking largely from the rich? We turn around, we transfer it to the poor in the form of all sorts of income assistance and welfare programs and social security benefits, and that's fine. That's what we do to help the poor. But I don't think a reasonable person could look at the data and conclude that we have anywhere near a flat tax system. One argument is we should just have a flat playing field and everybody should pay the same amount. There's another argument that says that, well, there are a lot of us who are born into lesser circumstances and maybe we should have a leg up, and the progressive tax system achieves that. Charity achieves that as well. One of the things that people will do when they claim that we have a flat tax is to employ a bait and switch. They'll say things like, Warren Buffett's true tax rate is 1/10%, and they come up with that number by taking Warren Buffett's income and dividing it by its wealth. But for the rest of us, we're paying 20%, except there's the bait and the switch. When you quote the 20% number for the rest of us, you're not taking taxes divided by wealth, you're taking taxes divided by income. And so this claim that somehow there's this true tax rate that's very low for the rich, what's happened is people have simply calculated some new metric that the government actually doesn't use and compared that to the tax rate that the rest of us pay and say that there's some great inequality here. When in fact, if you use the same equation in both places, either divide taxes by wealth, or divide taxes by income, you come up with the same conclusion, which is the rich are paying more than everybody else.
But aren't billionaires like Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, George Soros, and Michael Bloomberg making up for it by giving away tons of wealth through charity?
Americans give a tremendous amount voluntarily. In fact, if you put aside Medicare and count everything else the government does to help the poor, minus Medicare, Medicaid, Americans every year donate more to charity than the federal government spends on all of those welfare programs combined. So in that sense, we're remarkably charitable. One of the benefits of charity is that the people giving the money control it. And if I'm donating money, whether I'm a rich person or middle class or a poor person, I control where that money goes. And because I'm donating it, I want it to have the maximum impact. So if I find that a charity to which I'm contributing is wasting its money, it's not fulfilling the mission that I want it to fulfill, I can take my money away from that charity. I can starve it of resources. And all of a sudden, that charity has tremendous market incentive to do its job better. And if it doesn't do it better, it will go away and be replaced by a charity that will. When we rely on government to help the poor, we lose that feedback. And so we can have an institution that's helping the poor, and that institution is funded by taxpayer dollars. And if that institution strays from its mission or it starts to waste money, it's not doing what we want it to do, what's our recourse? We can't take our money back, right? The IRS agents come and they get very angry with you if you do that. We can vote in different politicians, but look at the number of steps we have to go. We have to wait for an election. We have to decide that this particular politician is going to take a hard look at this particular government agency. We have to hope that that actually happens, and we have to keep track of that so the next election that comes around, we can re-vote the person in or throw him out. And you can see there's a much greater buffer in the political system between the taxpayer and accountability of the agency that's helping the poor than there is in private charity, where the person who's donating can directly remove his money when he feels that the entity is not producing the results he wants. There's also another psychological phenomenon, and that's the engagement. I will tend to be much more engaged, much more concerned about what's going on with the poor and the activities of the charities if I'm giving voluntarily. If it's coming out of my taxes, my tendency is just not to think about it. And if you want an example of this, I give you Germany and churches. Unlike in the United States, where our churches are funded by private donations, in Germany the churches are funded by taxes. So you specify on your tax form what faith you belong to, and your certain portion of your tax dollars goes to that church. And what happens is you end up, and there are probably lots of other reasons for this as well, but this is one reason, you end up less engaged with the entity because you aren't voluntarily giving to it, and you know that it's not directly answerable to you.
Billionaires like Warren Buffett, whose income is from the stock market, use loopholes to wind up paying very low tax rates.
It's not a loophole. It is the fact that the Congress taxes our income. And when you take a loan, that's not income in the accounting sense of the word. It's a loan. And you might call it a loophole, but it's simply definitional. And furthermore, it's not something that billionaires take advantage of us. Anybody can do this, all the way down to a poor person who has a credit card and takes a cash advance on it, which I don't recommend, but you can do that. The cash advance is not taxed because it's not income, it's a loan. I think the concept of loophole is misapplied. We tend to say loophole whenever we find a section of the tax code that we don't like. The fact is that Congress deliberately wrote the tax code the way it's written. For example, for a number of years, Amazon was earning a profit, Amazon the corporation, earning a profit but not paying taxes. And we look at that and say, well, how can that be? That's not right. That must be a loophole. It's not a loophole. Congress deliberately wrote the tax code as follows. If you're a corporation and you incur losses over a long period of time, and then all of a sudden you make a profit, you can take those losses and you can balance them against the profit that you made. So for example, Amazon over many years, let's say it took a $10 billion loss and then all of a sudden made a $3 billion profit. Well, in total, it's down $7 billion. It shouldn't be paying taxes because it hasn't made any profit. Now, it made profit in 1 year, but that doesn't compare to the decade of $10 billion losses that occurred ahead of time. Why did Congress do this? It wrote the tax code like that precisely to give startup businesses some runway, some ability to incur losses, and then when you finally turn the corner, your company's doing well, you make your first profit, we're going to lay off you a little bit. We're going to let you get some air under your wings before we start taxing you. How much air are we going to give you? Well, once your total profits balance out with those losses that you incurred earlier, from that point forward, then we'll tax you. This was deliberate on Congress's part. Now, you might not like it. If you don't like it, you can call it a loophole, but it's not a loophole. It's deliberately written.
The billionaires, they own the corporations, they own the land, so of course they get to control who works or not.
That's not the case at all. Jeff Bezos, prior to his divorce, owned 11% of Amazon, and my guess is that's probably been cut close to half. So now he's probably around 5 to 6% of Amazon. Bill Gates owns 2% of Microsoft. Elon Musk purchased Twitter, and we imagine him purchasing the entire company. Actually, he purchased 8% of it. So to equate the company with the billionaire is actually false. Now, that's not to say that the billionaires don't have, when they own that much stock, they do have some substantial influence on the behavior of the corporation, but they don't own the corporation in that sense. And in fact, this raises an important question. If, for example, Bill Gates only owns 2% of Microsoft, who owns the other 98%? And the answer is the rest of us. We all do. Some of us own stock directly. A lot of us, over 50%, maybe 60% of Americans, own stock either directly or indirectly through a pension fund or retirement fund. Most people who invest own at least some shares of Microsoft. That means we're all owners of Microsoft. Who is Microsoft? Well, 2% of Microsoft is Bill Gates. The other 90% is us.
increasingly, a big part of the thing that they own is technology, and increasingly because of automation, they don't even need that many workers. They don't need human workers because they're replacing them with robots.
And that is correct. Automation does destroy jobs, but it also creates jobs. So automation in Amazon's factory replaces workers who physically move boxes from one place to another. Now robots move the boxes from one place to another. So while we have lost the jobs of human beings moving boxes, we have gained jobs of human beings who design, who build, who install, who maintain those robots. And in fact, if we look back on the 20th century United States, we find that from the early 1900s up until today, the number of jobs in the United States has grown from about 40 million in the early 1900s to 150 million today. That despite massive amounts of automation. If it were the case that automation on the net destroys jobs, we should see fewer than 40 million jobs in the United States today, not 150 million that we do see. And someone might say in response, okay, well maybe we have more jobs in the United States, but they pay less than they did in the early 1900s. And that's completely false. Compared to a century ago, the typical American household, by typical, forget about the top 1%, let's take the guy in the middle, solid middle class household today, earns about 4 to 6 times what a solid middle class household earned back in the early 1900s, and that's after adjusting for inflation. Their actual purchasing power, the standard of living today, is 4 to 6 times for the middle class what it was for the middle class in the early 1900s.
Now that their debunking effort has itself been debunked, what should Wired do next?
Some of the things that Wired said in the video are correct and worth talking about. For example, billionaires co-opting the government.
You need to understand that these people, they have political influence.
Yes, and that's the great irony. When you see a problem of the rich being able to co-opt government, our natural reaction is we need to stop that, which we do, but we tend to turn to government and say the government needs to stop this, but the government is the problem in the first place. So if we grant government more power, more authority for the purpose of stopping billionaires from co-opting government, all we do is create more power and more favors that politicians and bureaucrats can sell to billionaires. And so you end up actually achieving the opposite of what you want to achieve. And you get there because you misidentify the root problem. You think that the root problem is somebody acquiring billions of dollars. The root problem is a government that isn't constrained by its constitution and can do all manner of things it shouldn't be doing. When money can buy power, you have a problem. But the problem isn't the money, the problem is that there's power for sale. And generally, you get power for sale when you have a government that is blown past its constitutional constraints. The idea of a constitution is to draw a fence around the government and say the government may not act outside of these boundaries. Well, if those boundaries are no longer there, then the government can do all manner of things. And if the government can do all manner of things, politicians and bureaucrats have the ability now to sell favors to rich people. It's the selling of the favors that is the problem, not the money that's the problem.